Okay, so the easiest way to illustrate this further is just to look at an example. And what we have to do when we have an example like this one here is consider everyone who will be affected by the decision. And I've started listing some of the people who will be affected here. And we have to consider how they'll be affected in terms of their happiness. We have to consider how they'll be affected in terms of their happiness by the action that we perform. So in this case here, we have a choice between two actions. We can either share the food, and let's say if we do share the food, then both men will die, or we can give the food to the scientist so that he can live and create the cure for cancer. And so in order to determine which of these two actions, obviously neither one is really ideal, but in order to consider which one, or to figure out which one is the morally correct action, given that we have to choose one of them, we need to look at everyone who will be affected. So the scientist is going to be affected, the other guy is going to be affected, of course cancer patients are going to be affected, and so I think there are about 7 million people who die from cancer each year, so we actually have to consider all 7 million of those people. Then we also have, let's see, friends, family of the scientist. So all these people who are going to be affected by our decision have to be taken into account. And what we have to think about is how each one of them is going to be affected. And in particular, we want to consider how their happiness is going to be affected. And in order to do that, we have to put a value on the amount of happiness that we think they're going to get by our action. So this is a little off the cuff, but we'll consider a scale where 100 is the maximum amount of happiness, let's say, that anyone can have, and negative 100 is the minimum amount of happiness that anyone can have. So what we're going to do is consider how each person is going to be affected, how much happiness is going to be created for them by our action, or unhappiness, however it might be, and then we just need to sum up all those individual people's happiness and unhappiness. Whichever of our actions is going to, or is most likely going to, create the greater amount of happiness is the one that we is the morally correct action, according to utilitarianism. So let's just say that the scientist, if they share the food and both die, let's just say both guys die. Let's say they're relatively young, so they're going to die. And it's not going to be a very pleasant death either, starving on a raft. So we'll give them the maximum amount of unhappiness, negative 100. And let's say if we give the food to the scientist, he's going to live, he's going to cure cancer. Maybe that's, not the greatest thing that will ever happen to him in his life, but it's certainly got to be up there. So we'll give him a pretty high happiness value. Now the other guy, if we give the food to the scientist, he's going to die. Maybe he realizes he's going to die for a good cause, so we'll give him maybe not the maximum amount of unhappiness, but we'll give, obviously he's going to be pretty unhappy about dying, so we'll give him a negative 80. Now our cancer patients, they're not going to be too happy about dying, of course. They're never going to be cured. So we got 7 million of them. And of course all of them are going to die under different circumstances. Some are going to be children, some will be elderly, some will be their 20s and 30s. So we'll just average that out to, actually let's just make it, average it out to 90 each one. So that's each one of them gets a value of negative 90. So all of them together, this much, 630 million units of unhappiness are created. The cancer patients, by sharing the food. That's obviously a lot. So let me just fill the rest of this in. Okay, so I've completed the chart here, and just to save time. And so I've just assumed that each of the individuals, so the scientist, the other guy, and every single cancer patient has about 40 friends. So these are 40 people that are really going to be affected by the person living or dying. So we're not talking about Facebook friends here, but legitimately affected. And so using those numbers, I just multiplied things out. So here we have, so family and friends, so the scientist dies. Each of those people is going to get a negative 40 measure of unhappiness. And if the scientist lives, then each of those people will, say, get a measure of 10 units of happiness. Of course, every day we live, that doesn't make our friends necessarily especially happy, but the guy survived, and now he's happy, so they're going to be a little bit happy about that. And so basically we go through a similar type of calculation for the rest of this and just sum everything up. So these are the sums here, those in red. And so obviously, and of course you could tell this really without even doing the calculation, but obviously it's quite clear that giving the food to the scientist is going to create a lot more happiness overall than sharing the food and letting both men die. It's not even close. Giving the food to the scientist creates 3 billion units of happiness. Sharing the food, which leads to both people dying, both guys dying, is going to create 11 billion units of unhappiness, 11 billion units in the negative direction. And so clearly the morally correct thing to do, at least according to utilitarianism, is to give the food to the scientist. Now quickly, before I end, let me just say that obviously it's not necessary to do this calculation every time you want to see from a utilitarian perspective what the morally correct thing to do is. I just wanted to go through it in order to emphasize that we need to, 1, take into account every person that will be affected, and 2, we need to take into account how they're going to be affected. And then if we count, every person counts equally. Of course, some of them will be more happy or less happy or what have you. But every person's happiness or unhappiness counts equally, and so we just sum them up. And that's basically all that utilitarianism entails.